Chapter 29 of Fantomas by Marcel, Allain, and Pierre Souvestre. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Allain Winterowd. Fantomas by Marcel, Allain, and Pierre Souvestre. Translated by Cranston Metcalf. Chapter 29 Verdict and Sentence. Once more a wave of sensation ran through the court. There was not a single person present who had not heard of Juve and his wonderful exploits, or who did not regard him as a kind of hero. All leaned forward to watch him as he followed the usher to the witness box, wholly unaffected in manner, and not seeking to make any capital out of his popularity. Indeed, he seemed rather to be uneasy, almost nervous, as one of the oldest pressmen present remarked audibly. He took the oath, and the president of the court addressed him in friendly tones. "You are quite familiar with procedure, Monsieur Juve. Which would you prefer, that I should interrogate you, or that I should leave you to tell your story in your own way? You know how important it is, for it is you who are, so to speak, the originator of the trial today, inasmuch as it was your great detective skill that brought about the arrest of the criminal after it had also discovered his crime." "Since you are so kind, sir," Juve answered, "I will make my statement first, and then be ready to answer any questions that may be put to me by yourself or by counsel for the defence." Juve turned to the dock, and fixed his piercing eyes on the impassive face of Gurn, who met it unflinchingly. Juve shrugged his shoulders slightly, and turning half round to the jury, began his statement. He did not propose, he said, to recite the story of his inquiries, which had resulted in the arrest of Gurn, for this had been set forth fully in the indictment, and the jury had also seen his depositions at the original examination. He had nothing to add to, or to subtract from, his previous evidence. He merely asked for the jury's particular attention, for, although he was adducing nothing new in the case actually before them, he had some unexpected disclosures to make about the prisoner's personal culpability. The first point which he desired to emphasize was that human intelligence should hesitate before no improbability, however improbable, provided that some explanation was humanly conceivable, and no definite material object rendered the improbability an impossibility. His whole statement would be based on the principle that the probable is incontestable and true until proof of the contrary has been established. "Gentlemen," he went on, "hitherto the police have remained impotent, and justice has been disarmed, in presence of a number of serious cases of crime committed recently and still unsolved. Let me recall these cases to your memory. They were the murder of the Marquise de Langrune at her château of Beaulieu, the robberies from Madame Van den Rosen and the Princess Sonia Danidoff, the murder of Allain, the former steward of the Marquise de Langrune, when on his way from the neighbourhood of Saint-Jaury to Paris in obedience to a summons sent him by M. Germain Fuselier, and lastly the murder of Lord Beltham, prior to the cases just enumerated, for which the prisoner in the dock is at this moment standing his trial. Gentlemen, I have to say that all these cases, the Beltham, Langrune and Allain murders, and the Rosen Danidoff burglaries, are absolutely and indisputably to be attributed to one and the same individual, to that man standing there, Gurn." Having made this extraordinary assertion, Juve again turned round toward the prisoner. That mysterious person appeared to be keenly interested in what the detective said, but it would have been difficult to say whether he was merely surprised, or not rather perturbed and excited as well. Juve hushed with a wave of his hand the murmur that ran round the court, and resumed his address. "My assertion that Gurn is the sole person responsible for all these crimes has surprised you, gentlemen, but I have proof which must, I think, convince you. I will not go into the details of each of those crimes, for the newspapers have made you quite familiar with them, but I will be as brief and as lucid as I can. My first point, gentlemen, is this: the murderer of the Marquise de Langrune and the man who robbed Madame Van den Rosen and Princess Sonia Danidoff are one and the same person. That is shown beyond dispute by tests made in the two cases with the Bertillon dynamometer, an instrument of the nicest exactitude, which prove that the same individual operated in both cases. That is one point made good. And next, the man who robbed Madame Van den Rosen and Princess Sonia is Gurn. That is proved to equal demonstration by the fact that the burglar burned his hand while engaged upon his crime, and that Gurn has a scar on his hand which betrays him as the criminal. The scar is faint now, perhaps, but I can testify that it was very obvious at the time of a disturbance which occurred at a low café named the St. Anthony's Pig, where, accompanied by Detective Lemeroy, who is still in hospital for treatment for injuries received on that occasion, I attempted and failed to arrest this man Gurn. Thus, gentlemen, I prove that the Langrune and Danidoff cases are the work of but one man, and that man Gurn. I come to another point. As you know, the murder of the Marquise de Langrune was attended by some strange circumstances. At the inquest, it was proved that the murderer most probably got into the house from outside, opening the front door with a skeleton key, and that he obtained admission into the bedroom of the Marquise, not by burglarious means, I lay insistence upon that, but by the simple means of her having opened the door to him, which she did on the strength of his name, and finally, that if robbery was the motive of the crime, the nature of the robbery remained a mystery. Now I have ascertained, gentlemen, and if, as I shall ask you presently, you decide to have an adjournment and a supplementary investigation, I shall be able to prove two important facts. The first is that the Marquise had in her possession a lottery ticket which had just won a large first prize. The ticket had been sent to her by M. Etienne Rambert. This ticket was not found at the time, but it was subsequently traced to a person who, for the moment, has utterly disappeared, who declared that it was given to him by M. Etienne Rambert. And it is further noteworthy that M. Etienne Rambert seemed to be in greater funds from that time. The second fact I have ascertained is that, although M. Etienne Rambert pretended to get into a first-class carriage of a slow train at the Gare d'Orsay, he most certainly was not in that train between Vierzon and Limoges. I can, if you wish, call a witness who inspected all the compartments of that carriage, and can prove that he was not there. The probable, almost certain inference is that M. Etienne Rambert got into that slow train at the Gare d'Orsay for the definite purpose of establishing an alibi, and then got out of it on the other side and entered an express that was going in the same direction and in front of the slow train. You may remember that it was shown that all trains stopped at the mouth of the Verrières tunnel near Beaulieu, and that it was possible for a man to get out of the express, commit the crime, and then return. I would remind you of the footprints found on the embankment, and get into the slow train, which followed the express at an interval of 3 hours and a half, and get out of that train at Verrières station. The passenger who did that was the criminal, and it was M. Etienne Rambert. As I have already proved that it was Gurn who murdered the Marquise de Langrune, it seems to follow necessarily that M. Etienne Rambert must be Gurn." Juve paused to make sure that the jury had followed his deductions and taken all his points. He proceeded in the most tense hush. "We have just identified Gurn with Rambert, and proved that Rambert Gurn is guilty of the Beltham and Langrune murders, and the robbery from Mme. Van den Rosen and Princess Sonia Danidoff. There remains the murderer of the steward Dollon. Gentlemen, when Gurn was arrested on the single charge of the murder of Lord Beltham, you will readily believe that his one fear was that all these other crimes, for which I have just shown him to be responsible, might be brought up against him. I was just then on the very point of finding out the truth, but I had not yet done so. A single link was missing in the chain which would connect Gurn with Rambert and identify the murderer of Lord Beltham as the author of the other crimes. That link was some common clue, or better still, some object belonging to the murderer of Lord Beltham, which had been forgotten and left on the scene of the Langrune murder. That object I found. It was a fragment of a map, picked up in a field near the château of Beaulieu, in the path which Etienne Rambert must have followed from the railway line. It was a fragment cut out of a large ordnance map, and the rest of the map I found in Gurn's rooms, thereby identifying Gurn with Rambert. Gentlemen, the fragment of map which was picked up in the field was left in the custody of the steward Dollon. That unfortunate man was summoned to Paris by M. Germain Fuselier. There was only one person who had any interest in preventing Dollon from coming, and that person was Gurn, Or it would be better to say Rambert Gurn, and you know that Dollon was killed before he reached M. Germain Fuselier. Is it necessary to declare that it was Gurn, Rambert Gurn, who killed him?" Juve said the last words in tones of such earnest and solemn denunciation that the truth of them seemed beyond all doubt. And yet he read incredulous surprise in the attitude of the jury. From the body of the court, too, a murmur rose that was not sympathetic. Juve realised that the sheer audacity of his theory must come as a shock, and he knew how difficult it would be to convince anyone who had not followed every detail of the case as he himself had done. "Gentlemen," he said, "I know that my assertions about the multiple crimes of this man Gurn must fill you with amazement. That does not dismay me. There is one other name which I must mention, perhaps to silence your objections, perhaps to show the vast importance I attach to the deductions which I have just been privileged to detail to you. This is the last thing I have to say. The man who has been capable of assuming in turn the guise of Gurn, and of Etienne Rambert, and of the man of fashion at the Royal Palace Hotel, who has had the genius to devise and to accomplish such terrible crimes in incredible circumstances, and to combine audacity with skill, and a conception of evil with a pretence of respectability, who has been able to play the Proteus eluding all the efforts of the police, this man, I say, ought not to be called Gurn. He is and can be no other than Fantomas." The detective suddenly broke off from his long statement, and the syllables of the melodramatic name seemed to echo through the court, and, taken up by all those present, to swell again into a dread murmur. "Fantomas! He is Fantomas!" For a space of minutes, judges and jury seemed to be absorbed in their own reflections, and then the President of the court made an abrupt gesture of violent dissent. "Monsieur Juve, you have just enunciated such astounding facts and elaborated such an appalling indictment against this man Gurn, that I have no doubt the public prosecutor will ask you for a supplementary examination, which this court will be happy to grant, if he considers your arguments worth consideration. But are they? I will submit 3 objections." Juve bowed coldly. "First of all, Monsieur Juve, do you believe that a man could assume disguise with the cleverness that you have just represented? Monsieur Etienne Rambert is a man of 60. Gurn is 35. Monsieur Rambert is an elderly man, slow of movement, and the man who robbed Princess Sonia Danidoff was a nimble, very active man." "I have anticipated that objection, sir," Juve said with a smile, "by saying that Gurn is Fantomas. Nothing is impossible for Fantomas." "Suppose that is true," said the President with a wave of his hand. "But what have you to say to this? You charge Etienne Rambert with the murder of Mme. de Langrune, but do you not know that Etienne Rambert's son Charles Rambert, who according to the generally received and most plausible opinion was the real murderer of the Marquise, committed suicide from remorse? If Etienne Rambert was the guilty party, Charles Rambert would not have taken his own life." Juve's voice shook a little. "You would be quite right, sir, if again it were not necessary to add that Etienne Rambert is Gurn, that is to say Fantomas. Is it not a possible hypothesis that Fantomas might have affected the mind of that lad, have suggested to him that it was he who committed the crime in a period of somnambulism, and at last have urged him to suicide? Do you not know the power of suggestion?" "Suppose that also is true," said the President with another vague wave of his hand. "I will only put 2 incontestable facts before you. You accuse Etienne Rambert of being Gurn, and Etienne Rambert was lost in the wreck of the Lancaster. You also accuse Gurn of having murdered Dollon, and at the time that murder was committed, Gurn was in solitary confinement in the Santé prison." This time the detective made a sign as if of defeat. "If I have waited until today to make the statement you have just listened to, it was obviously because hitherto I have had no absolute proofs, but merely groups of certainties. I spoke today because I could keep silent no longer. If I am still without explanation in detail, I am sure I shall have them some day. Everything comes to light sooner or later, and as to the 2 facts you have just put before me, I would reply that there is no proof that M. Rambert was lost in the wreck of the Lancaster. It has not been legally established that he was ever on board that ship. Of course I know his name was in the list of passengers, but a child could have contrived a device of that sort. Besides, all the circumstances attending that disaster are still an utter mystery. My belief is that a Fantomas would be perfectly capable of causing an explosion on a ship and blowing up 150 people, if thereby he could dispose of one of his identities, especially such a terribly compromising identity as that of Etienne Rambert. The President dismissed the theory with a word. "Pure romance," he said. "And what about the murder of Dollon? I should like further to remind you that the fragment of map which, according to you, was the real reason for this man's death, was found on his body, and does not correspond in the least with the hole cut in the map you found in Gurn's room." "As for that," Juve said with a smile, "the explanation is obvious. If Gurn, whom I charge with the murder of Dollon, had been content merely to abstract the real fragment, he would, so to speak, have set his signature to the crime. But he was much too clever for that. He was subtle enough to abstract the compromising fragment and substitute another fragment for it, the one found on the body." "Perhaps," said the President, "that is possible, but I repeat, Gurn was in prison at the time." "True, true," said Juve, throwing up his hands. "I am prepared to swear that it was Gurn who did the murder, but I cannot yet explain how he did it, since he was in solitary confinement in the Santé." Silence fell upon the court. Juve refrained from saying anything more, but a sarcastic smile curled his lip. "Have you anything else to say?" the President asked after a pause. "Nothing except that anything is possible to Fantomas." The President turned to the prisoner. "Gurn, have you anything to say, any confession to make? The jury will listen to you." Gurn rose to his feet. "I do not understand a word of what the detective has just been saying," he said. The President looked at Juve again. "You suggest that there shall be a supplementary investigation?" "Yes." "Mr. Solicitor General, have you any application to make on that subject?" the President asked the Public Prosecutor. "No," said the functionary. "The witness's allegations are altogether too vague." "Very well. The court will deliberate forthwith." The judges gathered round the President of the court and held a short discussion. Then they returned to their places, and the President announced their decision. It was that, after consideration of the statement of the witness Juve, their opinion was that it rested merely upon hypotheses, and their decision was that there was no occasion for a supplementary inquiry. And the President immediately called upon the Public Prosecutor to address the court. Neither in the lengthy address of that functionary, nor in the ensuing address of Maître Barberoux on behalf of the defendant, was the slightest allusion made to the fresh facts adduced by the detective. The theories he put forward were so unexpected and so utterly astonishing that nobody paid the least attention to them. Then the sitting was suspended while the jury considered their verdict. The judges retired and guards removed the prisoner, and Juve, who had accepted the dismissal of his application for a further inquiry with perfect equanimity, went up to the press box and spoke to a young journalist sitting there. "Shall we go out for a quarter of an hour, Fandor?" And when they were presently in the corridor, he smote the young fellow in a friendly way on the shoulder and inquired, "Well, my boy, what do you say to all that?" Jérôme Fandor seemed to be overwhelmed. "You accuse my father? You really accuse Etienne Rambert of being Gurn? Surely I am dreaming." "My dear young idiot," Juve growled, "do pray understand one thing. I am not accusing your father, your real father, but only the man who represented himself to be your father. Just think if my contention is right, that the Etienne Rambert who killed the Marquise is Gurn. It is perfectly obvious that Gurn is not your father, for he is only 35 years of age. He has merely represented himself to be your father." "Then who is my real father?" "I don't know anything about that," said the detective. "That's a matter we will look into one of these fine days. You take it from me that we are only just at the beginning of all these things." "But the court has refused a supplementary inquiry." "Gad," said Juve, "I quite expected it would. I have not got the proofs to satisfy the legal mind. And then, too, I had to hold my tongue about the most interesting fact that I knew." "What was that?" "Why, the fact that you are not dead, Charles Rambert. I had to conceal that fact, my boy, for the melancholy reason that I am a poor man and depend on my job. If I had let out that I had known for a long time that Charles Rambert was alive when he was supposed to be dead, and that I had known him first as Jean and then as Paul, and yet had said nothing about it, I should have been dismissed from the service as surely as eggs are eggs, and it is equally certain that you would have been arrested, which is precisely what I do not wish to happen." In tense silence the foreman of the jury rose. "In the presence of God and man, and upon my honour and my conscience, I declare that the answer of a majority of the jury is yes to all the questions submitted to them." Then he sat down. He had made no mention of extenuating circumstances. The words of the fatal verdict fell like a knell in the silent court of assize, and many a face went white. "Have you anything to say before sentence is passed?" "Nothing," Gurn replied. In rapid tones the President read the formal pronouncement of the court. It seemed horribly long and unintelligible, but presently the President's words became slower as it reached the fatal words. There was a second's pause, and then he reached the point. "The sentence on the prisoner Gurn is death." And almost immediately he gave the order, "Guards, take the condemned away." Juve, who had returned to court with Fandor, spoke to the young journalist. "Gad!" he exclaimed, "I know what pluck is. That man is a truly remarkable man. He never turned a hair." End of chapter 29. Recording by Alan Winterowd. Boomcoach.blogspot.com